Welcome to the Free Equitism Podcast. I'm Clay Shentrup. Today, our guest is Felix Sargent, a software engineering manager from San Francisco with a passion for voting reform and economic systems. Felix has served as the chair of the board for the Center for Election Science, where he has been instrumental in promoting approval voting across various cities in the U.S. In this episode, we dive into Felix's background in software engineering and economics, exploring how his diverse expertise has shaped his approach to improving democratic processes. We discuss his thoughts on the 2016 election, the importance of election reform, and how approval voting can create more representative and less polarizing outcomes. Felix shares real-world examples of successful campaigns and the philosophical underpinnings of his advocacy work. Join us as we unpack complex voting methods, the impact of approval voting on elections and candidates, and the intersection of technology, economics, and democracy.
So I am a software engineer. I'm an engineering manager for the most part, and I live in San Francisco. I've been kind of working on that for a while. Most recently, I was the chair of the board for the Center for Election Science for the last 6 years. During that time, we managed to get approval voting passed in Fargo, North Dakota, as well as St. Louis, Missouri, and then had run a really, really close campaign in Seattle and done many other initiatives across the United States in order for us to implement voting reform. Professionally, I work as a software engineering manager. I've been a head of engineering, I've been director of engineering, I've done kind of like a little bit of everything on every kind of software engineering team. Although, one of the, we'll get into kind of like why I feel there's a crossover between like software engineering and like people who think about systems and democracy and things like that. But my degree is in economics. I studied economics at San Francisco State, which has an excellent economics department, at least as far as I understand it. But it's, it's all undergrad level stuff. So I don't want to try to pass myself off as more of like an economics expert or nerd than I am. Just, as long as people who enjoy this conversation are just coming at things from first principles and honestly, if they can point out things that I'm missing or where I'm wrong, all the more better to learn.
Yeah, well, I know that when we first kind of encountered each other, it was, there's this weird sort of small world effect when you get into social media. And I think particularly we were both on Twitter, like 2017. And I remember encountering your posts because you and I had both been in this sort of Twitter econ space, the people nerding out about economics, dead weight loss and all these fun concepts. And then I also saw you posting about, I think, approval voting or some voting stuff. And it was interesting. I don't know what kind of came first, but you sent me this email introduction. I think we ended up touching base, and then you got my email address and emailed me and kind of introduced yourself and kind of talked about your goals, mostly around like voting reform. But then I saw an announcement at some point, not too long after that you were joining the board of the Center for Election Science, which I thought was like, wow, that came out of left field for me. That was actually a nonprofit that I co-founded along with some other folks back in 2010. We finally got our 501c3 2011. So I'm actually, I want to come back to the economics angle and how these sort of dovetail with voting reform. But to get to the voting reform piece specifically, how did you come across this? How did you find the Center for Election Science, and what, motivated you to seek to join the board?
Yeah, it's a whole story. So I want to first say that, like, if it isn't obvious, I grew up in the UK. I became an American citizen. But I went through like high school. I did AP US history because I was 13 years old when I came here. When you really, really don't know the history, it makes you much more interested to study it. And so I got really, like, nothing made sense. And so I knew I had to start from scratch. It was the 2016 political election that really turned me on to approval voting. When Trump won the first time, I was shocked and disappointed. I'm a Democrat, and the thing I didn't understand that was most confusing to me was there were so many kind of like reasonable Republican candidates, right? Like Mitt Romney and the woman who ran eBay or PayPal or something like that.
Meg Whitman?
Meg Whitman. Yeah, right. Like reasonable, right? Like I could see Republicans just being like, oh, they're a reasonable person. Let's go for that. And then when Trump came in, everyone was like, oh God, this guy. And yet somehow he picked up momentum after the Iowa caucus, and because he was the polarizing candidate, right? Like everyone had their pick of the litter, and no one was able to coordinate except the people who like Trump really like Trump. And when we found out the results, we were in New York, and it was like 2 a.m. at the time where I woke up and actually checked my phone. We woke up my wife, and we just cried. Like, we're just really shocked that that was kind of the result, that this is what people would want, especially with all the allegations and things that are coming out of it. And it got me thinking about what is the point of an election, right? Why do we have elections in the first place? And surely that an election is for us to find the best of us, the best candidate for the job, right? And clearly he was not the best candidate for the job. The majority of people who participated in that Republican process voted against that guy. Majority voted against him.
You're talking about the primary.
Yeah, the primaries, exactly. Um, and well, even in the general, didn't he lose the popular vote? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
so there's that too. But like, why is this system so polarizing? Is something just very like keenly like it came up in my mind, and then I discovered Nikki Case's Guide to a Better Ballot. I believe they go by they, made just a really clear case for why the system of voting and how it's designed leads to the outcomes that we have. And not only did their work describe to me why like first past the post doesn't work and is polarizing, it also did this really great comparison, very very even-handed, very analytical comparison between ranked choice voting, approval voting, score voting, and Borda, and like just really comprehensive. And after that, I was just struck of like, okay, this is clearly the most important thing that I could be doing, right? Like if I always kind of had this mental model of work as hard, like work to give, right? Like work as hard as you can, donate time and donate money, but like don't make it your full-time job. Like make as much money as you possibly can, but then give whatever you can to trying to make the world better. Around the same time, I was asking myself, what's going to be the biggest bang for my buck? I didn't have a charity that I was really passionate about, like ACLU, Red Cross, like all of them were kind of like, I didn't see how it was really good leverage, right? I knew kind of about effective altruism, but even GiveWell, I liked as a nonprofit in theory, but I still didn't think it had leverage, right? And then I discovered the Center for Election Science. Well, I found the website, and the website was so terrible, I didn't think it was really an organization that existed. And then, so sorry, I said my wife cried. She was my fiance at that point. I had my wedding, and on my wedding day, at the after party, my wife's cousin, Eric Gastfriend, he got his MBA from Harvard or something, and set up the first effective altruism group at Harvard. And through EA Harvard, he knew Aaron Hamlin, the executive director at the time of the Center for Election Science. He said to me, like, it felt like The Godfather, like, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, on the day of your wedding. But like, he said, like, would you be interested in joining the board? And I was like, they still exist? Like, sure, let's do it. And literally on my honeymoon, taking a call with Aaron, being like, yeah, sure, I'd love to give all my time. I was like, what are you doing? And that's really kind of like how it got started. It was just kind of the ball got rolling, and very quickly, I became the chair of the board and kind of went from there.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, I don't want to go on a big tangent, but it could be useful to kind of you touched on a few aspects of the EA community there, which if the audience is not familiar, perhaps this earning to give, this give well, those are things that to you or I, those bring up very clear
They're
ideas.
nonprofits like any other nonprofit, right?
What's that?
They're nonprofits like any other nonprofit. I mean,
Well, but I think there's an entire worldview that we're touching on here, right? That could be useful to explain a bit about.
Yeah, but it's also self-explanatory, like earn to give, right? Like make as much money as you can and give as much money as you can, and let people specialize, right? I'm not specialized in nonprofit.
Well, I think there's a whole story. I mean, perhaps to touch on it here. So the effective altruism movement, right, is a movement. The Center for Effective Altruism was born out of this guy, William McCaskill. I think maybe the youngest professor ever at Oxford, at least in the Department of Philosophy. I think he was a full professor like at age 27 or something like this. And so his argument was, I think, I'll summarize it as, we all, many of us, choose charitable giving or charitable activities, oftentimes with little regard to the efficacy or like what's the leverage. So if we were investing in a regular business, we would do a lot of due diligence and say, what are the odds this business is going to pan out and give me a good return on my investment? But for some reason, it seems like we might end up walking down the street in San Francisco and someone jumps out of the bush and says, hey, would you like to donate to Mercy Corps? I literally had something like that happen to me, or for a few years I was donating to Mercy Corps because they just seemed like nice people, and I believe they call them like charity muggers, the term that Will McCaskill has used. Yeah, right. But it turns out that there's a really huge divergence between how much benefit to humanity can be achieved per dollar by the most efficient and least efficient charities. I think when you look at GiveWell, which is a sort of a nonprofit aggregator that tries to score these charities based on their effectiveness, they have some of these they're not sexy, but nonprofits that do things like malaria nets. So for like $5, you have this net. It can prevent malaria transmission, which can be debilitating or even lethal, and things in that vein. And I guess as part of that, the argument is that if you want to go do good for the world, maybe the best thing for you to do is not to go join the Peace Corps or do the work yourself, but to go earn as much money as you can. And you'll actually have more leverage by, spending that money toward these causes you care about, right? I think that's probably a useful context to the story, right? And later on, this the effective altruism movement also connects back to Center for Election Science, which is why I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean the big thing about this, not to immediately dive into philosophy, but like, it's utilitarian, right? And like, it's not utilitarianism based on values, right? It's not utilitarian like, okay, let's extract the maximum profit. It's like, these are our values. How do we maximize the benefit to humanity? How do we, reduce suffering? And especially like, one of the things that even the malaria net stuff, I think there's a differing. This is a tangent, but it's one I'd love to discuss with you. I don't think we've talked about it much, but like, very often, like, let's say there's this kind of like sliding scale of like people's like net worth or something, right? And so you have the super rich over here, you have the super poor over here, right? And then there's kind of this line where if you're above this line, you can give, and if you're below this line, you need. And like, I feel like a lot of people are kind of like, well, we need to serve the most poor the best. And part of my philosophy is like, yes, that will help, but really what we need to do is move the line of self-sufficiency lower, right? So that, like, because you want to increase the area of the people who can take care of themselves, right? You don't want to take from the rich and give to the poor. You want to make it so that the poor are wealthy, right?
Well, it sounds like you want to lift the line up of like how well off we all are. Maybe I don't want to get into too much ideological and
But what I mean to say is like there you want to create positive cycles, right? So if you get one person out of poverty who can start earning good money, who can then start donating to charity to get another person out of poverty, you get this positive cycle, as opposed to just like reparations. I think maybe that's not the right word, but as opposed to just ameliorating the problems, that instead you kind of like build people out of poverty. I think another big part of that like was always this sense of like, we studying economics, especially at San Francisco State, which of course is a bit woo-woo, but we focus a lot on climate policy, and there were so many things where economists were just saying, like, 90% of economists think doing this is a good idea. There's a consensus about what the right thing we need to do here. Consensus about global warming. Even there are very popular policies. And when you look at politics, politics does not represent consensus. And that was always a big kind of question of mine.
Yeah. Well, I think that maybe to kind of guide us back into the voting stuff. I think we should definitely unpack a lot of this economic and philosophical stuff because it's all related. But there is an interesting connection there between the effective altruism community and the Center for Election Science. And I'd like to kind of get back to that. That journey for you was hearing about this idea, and this could change things. You're particularly affected by the Trump election, and you're thinking about things like polarization, but also there's a specific reform package that CES offers. And so I'd love to understand more about how that spoke to you versus all of the alternatives. Like, why did that connect with the problem that you saw?
Yeah, I think it's mainly because when you look at the return on investment on political reform is huge. Ultimately, there's a lot of consensus for the policies that are out there, right? People want common sense gun reform. People want common sense healthcare, right? Especially considering they're literally shooting CEOs in the street these days. Dear God, we need to reform these systems, and it's not like we don't have better things that we can switch to. Maybe there's not perfect, but we can get better. Instead, what we have right now is gridlock, and that gridlock is created by the voting method that we have, right? And so, approval voting doesn't just affect who wins; it affects the quality of who wins, right? It can be one person if you elect someone with your values, but they're incompetent. It's another thing if you elect someone with your values, and they're really good at getting legislation written and getting people organized around you. And one of the things that I identified with the Center for Election Science and especially approval voting was that if this is the systemic issue, then we can fix the systemic problem with approval voting. And on top of that, the more I got involved, the more I saw that it works with existing voting machines, right? It's really easy to be able to implement it with, it's popular. It makes sense to people.
So far we haven't actually defined approval voting, and I know there are a whole menu of alternatives. So maybe talking just briefly about what is the mechanism, how does it work, and then why that versus the alternatives, right? I think most listeners would nod their head in agreement that it sounds like there are these problems and there's polarization, and but what specifically does this mechanism do, and versus other mechanisms to solve those problems? And versus a lot of people are focused on things like the electoral college or gerrymandering or the money in politics. Why this reform for you?
Yeah, I mean the number one effect that the biggest problems we see in politics is that someone wins without a majority support or consensus, right? And if someone wins with less than 50% of the vote, then most people voted against that candidate. So we're not really getting a clear signal from the electoral process that it actually worked properly. And that's a very simple metric. And it's exacerbated when more and more people run, right? So if you have 10 people running for an election, well, now the person who wins can win with 12% of the vote. That's pretty abysmal. And we have documented elections where that happens. And that's one of the reasons parties exist in the first place, is to exclude candidates from running. But they just push the problem down into primaries. It doesn't actually fix anything. So, what we have this terrible system, and we've got a bunch of band-aids to it. And what they do is they eliminate choice and they stop fair competition, and instead runs through politics and networks and money and competition that happen a lot behind closed doors. And in a lot of ways, you could say it's not actually democracy. A real democratic election, everyone who wants to run should run, and the person who is the most popular and who makes the best case should win. I think that that's a fairly common principle that we all agree on. But if you can only pick one candidate, then the vote splits, and effectively, if there are lots of candidates running, the winner is randomized. right? Like it really becomes very random because, as we see in, unless there's a very polarizing candidate that can get, like its little clump that still probably wouldn't have majority support, um, you know, people don't coordinate on who they're going to vote for just to eliminate vote splitting unless there's something like a party that exists.
Right.
So, and this effect is huge, right? It means the wrong people win, and it doesn't aim for competence in the first place either, right? Because they're not. It's not a fair competition.
Right.
Under approval voting, it solves it really easily, where you can vote not just for one candidate, you can vote for as many candidates as you like, and the candidate with most votes wins.
And there's
Right?
no ranking.
So there's no ranking. It works with existing ballots. You just say, I like this candidate and this candidate and this candidate, right? And people are familiar with ranking, and they say, well, I want to indicate my favorites and stuff. But whether or not we want to get into that whole discussion, I'll leave to you. You want to go there?
The story for me is, there were a lot of options you had. Something about this appealed to you versus the other alternatives, and I think it's irrelevant to the
it was
with Trump.
It was a KISS solution, right? Like yeah, look with right. Like I know that the Republican 2016 primary election, like if he'd done approval voting, a different candidate would have won, right? Like that's very, very clear. I don't have the numbers on who actually would have won, but people did polls, right? Because people do have approval polling, right? You can see the world where that election happened that way. You think that would probably be a better world.
Well, I mean, I know there was this epic Warren Smith post. For those who don't know, Warren Smith is the brilliant but cantankerous Princeton math PhD who founded the Center for Range Voting, now known as Score Voting, and then he was a co-founder, short-lived, of the Center for Election Science. And way back in 2015, he posted an article, alluding to the exact point you made, where Trump is basically gaming the system, where he is this aberration, and he's running against a broad field of candidates like Jeb Bush and Chris Christie, and people who are your more traditional Republicans. And so if each one of those traditional Republicans gets like 15% of the vote, even if a majority wants that traditional Republican, Trump still gets more votes than any single one of them. It's the vote splitting issue on steroids.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that definitely supports your point in that case. So hearing about this, approval voting stuck out because of mainly, it sounds like the simplicity was a big thing.
Well, yeah, the simplicity, and like I was already familiar with ranked choice voting, but like again, like the people understand how the ballots work, but people are very ignorant to how the actual runoff works. And when it comes down to it, instant runoff voting, it didn't seem to solve the problem, because in instant runoff voting is just a runoff election, right? Like they have in France, and it just happens faster, right? Like that's why they call it instant runoff. But you still have the problem where if there's a good candidate, everyone's second choice candidate, they'll still lose, right? They'll get eliminated because, ranked choice voting leads towards polarization. Anyway, like Nicky Case's argument just kind of listed out, here's why these things are probably, the right thing. And, I just resolved to myself, well, if there's not an organization that's already trying to do this, I'll start one. And then I found CES, and thankfully I didn't have to start it. But that's why I emailed you, is because I saw that we were kind of like on the same page here. I just wanted to do something, right?
Yeah.
And, I think it's a pretty logical step of bad elections lead to bad policies, which leads to bad outcomes, right? We often know the right answer, but politics gets in the way. If we can improve the elections, which improves the politicians, which improves the policies, which improves the outcomes, we end up with a better world for everybody. And, this is later, but like when I saw how, the Fargo campaign was incredibly cheap. Running an initiative process in a lot of cities costs nothing compared to the level of logistics that's needed to, do any kind of poverty amelioration, right?
Yeah, introduce us to that. You said Fargo campaign. What happened in Fargo?
So Fargo, North Dakota, I don't have all the details off the top of my head because I'm incredibly bad with numbers. But in Fargo, there was a election for mayor that elected a candidate that really wasn't popular at all. And so before the mayor actually came in from that election, the sitting council created a committee in order to investigate better voting methods, because they're like, oh crap, like we really don't like this guy who's coming in. And so then the commission kicked off. The head of the commission was named Jed. And then the commission did a bunch of studies. Jed was really informed and said, let's do approval voting. And of course, when they actually delivered the report, the mayor was this guy nobody liked, and they just put it under the table. And Jed said, well, that's not going to fly. I put a lot of work into this. I'm going to start my own campaign and get it going. He had a lot of political support, and people also kind of it made sense to people, because ultimately that unpopular mayor, who won with something like 32% of the vote, wasn't popular. And so people were kind of like, great, this is going to fix that problem. Fantastic. And Fargo's a small town. People know each other. People knew Jed. And they got on the ballot, and it passed by a huge amount. Approval vote.
Like 64%, I think.
Yeah.
Majority. Yes,
63.5%.
Almost 64.
I mean,
I hadn't heard about the unpopularity. I remember hearing about how some candidate, because of vote splitting, won with like 17%. And they have two different elections. They have the mayoral race, and then they have two winner elections where you could vote for up to two. And so like you could get 7 candidates running and the top 2 win, and then like somebody won with 17%. So even if they were like the best candidate, the optics of that are, 17% doesn't give us any assurance that this was really you being popular, versus just a lot of candidates ran and that vote was just split between so many people. We just don't really know if you were the right winner, or if that was kind of a roll of the dice. Okay. And it sounded like that really resonated with the voters in Fargo. You did allude to this. I think there's a term for it in the literature, right? The center squeeze effect. Could you maybe give a concrete example of that? 'Cause I think for a lot of people, the intuition is, well, a ranked ballot, ranked choice voting has all this momentum, and a ranked ballot lets me say sort of a more accurate picture where I can say, this is my number 1, this is my number 2 backup choice, my number 3. And there's a certain fidelity and expressiveness there. And I know that for those who care more about the practical simplicity aspects, approval voting is a no-brainer. It's easy, no voting machine upgrades. But for a lot of folks who really want that expression, there's this superficial feeling that ranked voting gives them more. And I think the point you're making is that's kind of illusory, but maybe an example would help demonstrate that. I don't know the numbers, but the thing that the most prominent example I can think of with this in the last few years has been the state of Alaska, which was one of 2 states that adopted instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting. And there was a House special election where there was a 4th candidate, I think, who got so little votes he was almost a non-entity. But the 3 main candidates were Mary Peltola, who was like the Democrat, and then you had Sarah Palin, a Republican, and this guy Nick Begich, who was maybe a little bit more of a traditional Republican. I don't know if he was more moderate, probably more mainstream, arguably more credible than Sarah Palin.
He wasn't Sarah Palin, right?
He wasn't Sarah Palin, right? He wasn't quite as extreme or whatever. Right. But we got all the ranked ballot data. So regardless of the actual numbers, we know that a sizable majority of voters preferred Begich, so the relative moderate there, I guess you'd say, to Mary Peltola. Not surprising, because Alaska's a red state. That a sort of traditional Republican would defeat her by a majority. And also head to head against Sarah Palin, he was preferred by a majority. But he got eliminated.
The numbers right here, where of the 165,000 voters who expressed a preference, 61.4% preferred Begich to Palin.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Like 61% preferred Begich to Palin. And then when it comes to Begich versus Peltola, of the 167,000 voters who expressed a preference, 52.5% preferred Begich to Peltola, right? So
it's like they expressed a preference, but the voting method just kind of ignored it. You've got this guy who's an undisputed majority favorite against both of his rivals, but he gets eliminated because of how you're only looking at that one first preference at a time, and you never even see that, well, so many people had Begich as their second choice, and that's just kind of
Because
lost. So I
they'll
think,
say, well, I like Peltola, but I hate Palin, so I'll vote for Begich second. And then people are like, well, I love Palin, but I hate Peltola, so I'll vote for Begich second. And so, like, everyone agrees, Begich would probably make the most people happy.
yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't look at that.
So
Look,
approval voting maybe on the surface.
like, ranked choice voting, like the problems with ranked choice voting aren't like these scenarios are rare, right? Like it's rare that this kind of error happens, and ranked choice voting does solve the spoiler effect in most cases where it happens. It is significantly better than ranked than choose one voting, but at the same time, the complexity that's involved, the lack of understanding about the results, the way that a candidate who has less first choice votes in the first round can win, like so many every time that a ranked choice voting isn't like a slam dunk, people are like, it was fraud, the system is broken. They had a ton of that in Alameda in Oakland for the Oakland mayoral system, like people protesting, demanding complex recounts, demanding hand counts of ranked choice ballots is a nightmare. The system adds so much complexity for very little benefit. Whereas, I don't want to get too mathy, but like one of the things I love the most about the comparison is you can sum a score, right? If like you like a person and I like a person, then there are two likes, right? But let's say you like ABC and I like CBA, right? Or candidate C, then candidate B, then candidate A, right? How do we sum that together, right? That you can't add those. You need kind of an elimination process. But ultimately, like CBA and ABC, well, maybe B should win, I guess. But you have to come up with like a way to like, you're not just using a mathematical operation there. Whereas, like, let's say if you did want to establish preferences, you can say, I want 5 stars for C and 3 stars for B and 1 star for A. And you could do the inverse of that on your side. You can add it together. You get a score at the end of it. And that's
so
why
you're getting a score voting as opposed to ranked voting.
Well, I mean, all to say, like, approval voting is just score voting, but you just have a 0 or a 1, right?
A binary
like,
scale.
Yeah. All I mean to say is that you're giving more information in an approval voting ballot than you are in, well, kind of in a rank. Like, basically, you want to give as much information as easily as you can, right?
Well, certainly more of it is used.
Yeah.
Like, once you cast your ballot, it's all used. I know one thing that really impressed me was like a decade ago, the Occupy Wall Street folks did this exit poll, and they did it in Manhattan. So, of course, it was skewed Democrat, but that's not the point. The point is when you look at, they did the same poll on the same voters, like an exit poll, with 3 different voting methods. So they had like plurality voting, approval voting, actually 4, score voting and instant runoff voting, aka ranked choice voting. And I know there were things like where, every minor party, third party candidate gets like 2-3% or something like this. But with ranked choice voting, Jill Stein, for instance, of the Green Party, she gets just a tiny bit more votes. And then she's eliminated, and like eventually Obama wins by a landslide. But you have to think that probably at least half of those Obama voters had Stein as their second choice, but you just can't see that at all. So you can't even see like the growth of these third parties in the results. But then you look at like the score voting results or the approval voting results, and Stein and these other candidates get like half as many votes as Obama. So that's not enough to win by any means, but it's like showing that, oh, actually their support is not like 2%. There's actually like, something like almost 40% of voters willing to cast a vote for them. And it completely changes the optics. And, that seems like a big thing if we want to escape like a 2-party system and have more choices, right?
For sure. I think actually one of the conclusions that I've come to kind of most recently, and after a long time at the Center for Election Science, we had a Washington State House representative on the chair of the board, Christine Reeves, and she told us this amazing story about her first campaign, where she was running for office and she was competing against other Democrats, who's all in the primary. Because it was going to be a Democratic win. It was just kind of like who was in the primary. And she has another candidate that's very like her. They're friends as best as they can be throughout the campaign. And she talks about how, like, it's so busy when you're on an election, and then let's say you lose the election, and then suddenly all the phone calls stop. You've been working so hard to try to get um, people to support you and vote for you and everything, and then when the election's over, it's crickets. And she there's no explanation why she got the outcome that she got, because the she's very similar to this other candidate, and there was just vote splitting, and they were just a fraction more ahead in that primary for them to win. And one of the things that I think approval voting is most compelling for is the candidates, right? Like, the current first past the post system attracts masochists, right? Like, it is such a horrible system to go into, because, well, let's say, if you're not a Democrat or Republican, and you're not a leading Democrat or Republican, you're wasting your time and your money, and it's humiliating in order to run. Whereas when you are running in an approval voting election, there's a lot more camaraderie. You have to be nicer to people, because ultimately your job is to get the most people to think, oh, why not? Or they're not so bad, right? Like just to clear the bar. You don't have to be the best. You just have to be good enough that they would vote for you. And if the most people think that you're just good enough, then you'll win. But also, you need to beat the other. You need to be better than the candidates next to you. But for the person you're talking to, when you're convincing the vote, they just need to think, like, well, you're not a horrible person, so I will approve of you as well.
Yeah,
and at the end of the day,
that resonates.
You see the results, and, like, you can say, oh, I got 67% of the vote. Now someone else got like 70% of the vote. Like, someone else got 70% approval. They won, but people like me. I'm going to try to run again, right? And that's what we want. We want good candidates to run again, and we want bad candidates to stop running. And I think that we don't, like, if I could get this message out to any people, I would love CES and all the organizations that are focused on voting reform to talk to the candidates who have lost, and to give them the narrative about why they lost, and to help them, understand that, whether they should run again or try again, and help them measure how much support they actually have.
Yeah, I know there's some fear with that you could end up getting these results that are, too mediocre. Like the candidate who wins is sort of milquetoast. The way I thought about that is
With
that
approval voting,
that
people
were
are kind of like
well,
if there's an election and, like, the most boring candidate will win.
well, when you talk about like the person who can get the most people sort of like just barely over the line, and I think the thought experiment that I walk through is, if that were true and that were a problem, you can imagine two hypothetical candidates who are both like they're neck and neck, right? Number one, number two. And if that argument were true, let's just say they're both really milquetoast. But one of those candidates can find a way to get, to embrace some policy, to make some sort of statement that gets some set of voters now to come over the line, to increase their, not eccentricity, but their support for that candidate, and without losing more than they've gained. Now they're going to have a leg up by being less milquetoast and actually embracing some issues. So it feels like it's not that you're milquetoast, but it's that you have to find a way to reach broadly to all people as much as possible, as opposed to just going for your base. That's kind of how I read it.
Right. Yeah. This is the ranked choice voting critique of, like, oh, well, it leads to milquetoast candidates. One, show me the study. Like prove it first and foremost. But two, like, milquetoast, it's like, that's like the candidate who wins. Like, let's say that there's a really exciting candidate and then a really boring candidate. They have exactly the same policies. The exciting candidate will win because, they might get either similar turnout, or people just say, like, well, I like the excited candidate more, right? It's like, that's a kind of a weird kind of, like, hypothetical scenario. But even then, like, when people are saying milquetoast, what they're really saying is not polarizing, right? And they seem to think that it's analogous, that, like, that an exciting and good and dynamic personality will also be polarizing. And it's like, no, if you have nuanced policies where you say, like, hey, here's my gun control platform, it works for everybody, or whatever policy you want to go for, and then people are going to be like, okay, I guess, right? Then I think the problem is that you require kind of a different mindset of politics when you use a different system, right? Right now, our mindset of politics is that, like, well, there are the Republicans and the Democrats, and they're all very much in their own camps, and there's not really a moderate, but they swing elections, right? And these are the people, there's this missing middle of voters who are just kind of like, I don't know what the difference is between Kamala and Trump, right? But these are the people who vote and, like, win the elections.
Yeah.
Or, like, apparently the last election, it was decided from people who were like, wait, Biden dropped out? Like, are you kidding? But, like, what instead you want to do is say, like, in an election with approval voting, a lot of the front runners in those elections are going to be really similar, right? Like the way, rather than our current system where the two front runners couldn't be more different. Instead, you're going to have these elections which actually are kind of boring, where you have, like, a bunch of really nice, professional, well-educated people that are going to be that are going to be representative of their community. I should say they're going to be representative of their community, but they're going to be popular, but they're going to be relatively similar. And, like the exercise is going to be splitting hairs between the candidates. And it's like, well, if you've got 5 great people to choose from, how do you pick one? And the nice thing is approval voting picks one, but, like, when, let's say you have 3 or 4 clones running, if you pick one of them, if they're clones, it doesn't matter, right? Like, you still get the same beneficial outcome where everyone's going to feel like, well, great, I voted for that person anyway. I think that's a really positive scenario, and people just can't fathom that world where, like, you're trying to choose from a bunch of really great people.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting, the last election in Fargo, where it was an election for 2 people, and in one election you can vote for as many as you want, though you're not restricted to just 2 like they used to be. And the incumbent, gay kind of center left mainstream Democrat guy, he was fairly progressive. I would call him center left. He's
You're talking
still
about John Strand.
Strand, I guess. Yeah, and I think it's his last term. But he's well known in the community. He's very, he's not polarizing. He's definitely more in the Democratic wing, but he's just somebody who kind of stands up for the community, and he's well liked, and he's got some longevity there. But the other candidate who won was actually, on the surface, quite dissimilar. I think it's Michelle Thunberg.
Yeah.
And she used to be a newscaster there. I mean, she's like a confessed Trump supporter, but she is somebody who, the way she presents is, I mean, she does not present as a polarizing, heated, she's not a Marjorie Taylor Greene type, right? She's fairly well spoken, obviously, because she was a newscaster. She's well known in the community. And so when you look at her rhetoric and her way of talking, even when you may feel ideologically different than her, there's a certain civility to it and a professionalism to how she operates. And I feel like that's kind of in line with what we're saying here. It's not that she's certainly not milquetoast, but she's also not out of her. Yeah, she's professional. I think that's good to see. What do you think about the way we think of American politics right now, at least in partisan elections? I find so interesting is that, generally speaking, the primary sort of nominates somebody who's roughly at the center of their party. So if you divide the electorate roughly up into, like, the left half and the right, conservative and liberal, and you take roughly the middle of each, so maybe someone like John McCain and Barack Obama when they faced off, you have this inherent, like, bimodal distribution of our politics, to where you really kind of have to pick a side. And I think the most interesting thing to me about approval voting at scale would be that I would see that moving more toward a convergence where you have someone a little center right and someone a little center left, but there's not so much black and white there. There's more of a nuance to it, and we're able to look more at, like, qualifications and experience, because the divide ideologically is not so stark. So then we start caring more about things like, just their qualifications and their, the competence for the job more generally. What do you think about that? If tomorrow we instituted approval voting, do you think that the current system and the parties would have so much inertia that it would feel very similar for, like, a decade? Like, how quickly would we feel a change in that dynamic?
Definitely immediately. I mean, I think the there would be longer shifts in what parties would mean, right? But I think for the first few elections, people would go through the party system, and then it would, what would happen is that each candidate, like, I don't see both the Republicans and the Democrats switching to approval voting at the same time, right? But like in this magical world,
Oh, no. Sorry, not in the primary. I mean, in the general election, I mean.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not talking about primaries.
Well, I think first and foremost, like, you're still going to get a lot of the center of power coming out of the Democrats and the Republicans, right? You're not going to have third parties come up and instantly kind of like sweep, right? Or independent candidates. I just don't think that they have the infrastructure necessary in order to be able to run a campaign that's that large. But like, but assuming that they have an approval voting primary, they're going to put their best candidate forward, and what's going to happen is that there will be some independents, and they will run, they will get a little bit better, but you're going to see a lot of the action still happening in the primaries. But let's say there's a split, right? Let's say there's a scenario in the Democrats where they run their primary, and their secondary candidate, let's call him Bernie Sanders, for example, runs and says, like, I got robbed. Hillary, if we do that 2016 election again,
she's part of the machine.
Right. But basically, if in that world, Bernie Sanders should have said, I'll run it as an independent. I've got my own machine set up. I've got my own base. I can just extend what I had from the primary, because I was always a very strong contender for the Democratic Party nomination in the first place. And like, Bernie had a lot of like supporters from like working class Trump-esque supporters. And I think he actually won stolen votes from Trump as well. Like, you look at the approval voting polls that came out with YouGov, and like Bernie like won the 2016 election with like 68% of the vote. I don't, like, that's not the real world, but he had really high approval ratings because people liked what they were saying. People liked his indignation. People liked his, like, we've got to fix the healthcare system, and I think everyone agrees with that. And so just like all of the, I can, I do think, like, Bernie's a radical as opposed to a professional in a lot of ways, but like, at the same time, that still made more sense, like, coming from the world that I inhabit, and I look at the problems in America. Like, at least I felt like Bernie was at least like living in the same universe, like Trump's universe and even Hillary's universe. Like, what's your plan? Like, it made more sense. But so extending from that, like, if you do have an independent win, or an independent like do really, really well, where we say like, okay, Hillary still won, or maybe Trump still won, but Bernie came in second place and Hillary was third, which I think would have been much more likely. Then you see the Democratic Party fracturing, and people go, oh no, what does this mean? But ultimately, like, parties exist to eliminate choice. If you have an approval voting election, you don't need to eliminate choices. Right. So, as many people can run as may want to run, as long as, voters can like figure out how, the interstate ballot qualification laws and all these other things. There's no point in running for president in just one state. It doesn't make any sense. So you need to be part of a large enough organization in order to be able to provide that level of momentum. But, it means that parties become a lot less strong and candidates become a lot more meaningful, right? And then, and I think that means you actually have a lot more of a track, right? Where, like, okay, I was governor of this state, and my, and I'm popular, and people, I was the governor of Texas, you should elect me, right? I was the governor of California, you should elect me, right?
Yeah.
Or senators, or
For me, the elephant in the room there, this might have gone under the radar, but a lot of people think of this escaping from two-party system as, hey, if you get this better voting method, maybe all of a sudden, like, Green Party candidates, libertarians, sudden will grow in support. And I think you're depicting, I think, what is a more plausible model, which is that the existing major parties are going to fracture to some extent, because now you really have these parties that are not really a cohesive party. You've got like the MAGA party and the GOP shoved together in this awkward marriage, and then you've got like the Pete Buttigieg sort of neoliberal
Democrats, right? Like, all the time,
AOC. Yeah, so those can split, and so you end up getting multiple parties because now you get more pure parties from what already exists in the mainstream realm, as opposed to necessarily tomorrow we wake up and like, oh, look, a libertarian is our governor now or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, but even then, like it does, like I think there's space for radicals in that world. I mean, again, as I said, Bernie was very popular, and Bernie's a radical, and like I think that democratic elections can result in radicals, but
Yeah.
but like that again, me using the word radical is like this sense of the spectrum of like what's in the Overton window, what's in the realm of acceptable discourse about the things we can and can't change, right? And that's one of the reasons I love approval voting is that it allows people the benefit of saying like, well, I don't think this candidate's going to win, but I like what he's saying, right? So I'm still going to give them the support. And then, I like what this candidate's saying, and I think she's going to win, and I'm also going to support her. Or maybe I think she has enough support, and I'm not going to, and I'm just going to go for the people I truly care about. Like it allows people to draw their own line, and ultimately it means that things don't get left unsaid because they don't think that they're possible, right? That's the thing, when you have more candidates running, now suddenly you get more voices represented, because now suddenly someone's saying, hey, I'm going to go after the Native American vote, right? And see if I can build a platform there, and then see if I can broaden it, right?
Yeah.
And that's the way people will start, right? They start with the communities they know, and then if their appeal can grow and get more broad, then they can get to higher positions of power. It's it works the way that people think democracy is meant to work, right? Where the most popular person wins. It's just that like we have a really dumb system.
Yeah. Well, having I think kind of explored approval voting, what else is on your mind around democracy reform? I know we talked earlier about some of the things people typically think about when you bring up like how do we fix our democracy, and I don't think that you or I think those are the priority. We're a little bit into these more esoteric or different ideas, but what are the other things that are on your radar in terms of at least things that are practical to work on, not just pie in the sky? Or do you feel that like approval voting would solve so much that's kind of where your chips are all placed for major voting reform activism?
Yeah,
like,
I hope you're thinking about it rhetorically, but like ultimately, when it comes down to it, like approval voting is cheap. Like that's the thing that drives me the craziest is that like Center for Election Science, I don't have a good fundraising network, right? But at the same time, like Center for Election Science really doesn't need a lot of money to make a huge impact. And you see what's done, what people have done with ranked choice voting and how much money they've had and how many campaigns they've lost, right? Because the system is complicated and people don't understand how it works, which is, it's like they got it but so all I mean to say is
real quick though, that's a good point we skipped over earlier. I think it's useful here. We just had elections in like 7 states, something like that, around ranked choice voting. I know it was almost repealed in Alaska. It was like 200 votes shy or something like that, and they're doing a recount. I don't know what the status is, but isn't it the case that in every other state that was going to advance it, it failed? I think it was like 7. I don't know if you have those numbers.
It even got banned in a bunch of places as well.
Right.
So, ranked choice voting right now is like the Republicans' whipping boy, right? They love saying that it's something that's fundamentally biased towards Democrats. And, I see why they think that, especially after what happened in Alaska. It's Sarah Palin, for crying out loud. It wasn't, she still has pull in the party. And so, I like ranked choice voting. It confuses people. And not only that, it's expensive. It's expensive to implement. It's expensive to run a campaign for. People think that they're getting tricked, right? Whereas, approval voting, you kind of can't think that. So that, like, when you ask me about all the other, what other systems could be implemented, such as like national interstate compact for popular vote, so that the presidential winner is the most votes. One, I can't believe you showed me this tweet, and I hope it's real, or hope it's not real, that Donald Trump was like, well, they're trying to get rid of the popular vote, and I won the popular vote. Like, oh my God, do you not know how this works?
Yeah, it was as if he was saying they're trying to institute an electoral college, and it's like, no, we have an electoral college. This can't be real.
No, it's ridiculous. But like, the electoral college is a very, very small distortion compared to approval voting. Same thing with gerrymandering. Like, and like gerrymandering is one of those interesting things that people get really dogged about. And like gerrymandering is bad, but like under approval voting, because you're electing basically the center of opinion for whatever area you make, it doesn't really matter how you draw the area, because if you like extend the area just a little bit this way and a little bit that way, then you'll shift the center a little bit this way and a little bit that way. As
Yeah.
opposed to under first past the post, if you shift it just this way, suddenly it'll go from red to blue, right? It'll switch completely rather than just be kind of like be representative of the demographics and move like this. I think it's also
Yeah, because
important to talk about like,
candidates.
demographic change as well. Like, we talk a lot about how boomers are still running the economy despite being a very small, like not a substantial part of the labor force anymore. And like, one of the great things about approval voting is that it represents demographic change a lot better as well, because it tends to elect the moderate.
So it sounds like, to summarize that basically, yes, there are other things worth fixing, but for you, approval voting has so much bang for the buck that you just don't really need to waste a lot of your time until that, boulder has been rolled up the hill, I guess.
Well, yeah,
And
I
it's
mean,
kind of rolling on its own.
like let's say there's a world where you fix the popular vote, Trump still would have won, right? Not that this goal is like not letting Trump win, but even if you fix gerrymandering, I think that there would be some improvements from gerrymandering. But like again, it's band-aids on the problem, and the problem is choose one voting. There is like, but there are better things you can do. So if you want to do like proportional representation in Congress or something, then I think that's important. I mean, we already have proportional representation kind of in the House, kind of. Like it's proportional by population at least, but it's not proportional by party.
How do you mean?
The House is proportionally distributed by states, like House seats.
The seats, but not the
Yeah.
representation. It's not in
No,
any
no,
way.
not the representation. But like if you want to basically use the same kind of thing, but again, you and I have talked about this before, but like proportional representation, it's really, really hard to understand like how it works. Like it's kind of like, okay, we get this thing and then we do a bunch of math and then the answer comes out right at the end. And like people like intuitively agree with the answers, but it's very difficult to follow the math of like, well, how did my vote actually change the outcome there? And also it would require massive constitutional reform, right? Whereas approval voting really works from the bottom up. Like most of the time, like I've seen in a lot of legislators and a lot of legal codes, like choose one or only vote for one candidate. It's not even written anywhere.
Well, not
like,
constitutional reform.
It's just kind of like, this is just the way we always did it. And so all you need very often is just a reform to the electoral code. And a lot of times that can happen just by a simple majority of a board, right? Like a city council or something else like that. So
proportional representation does not require constitutional reform, but it would require changing the federal law that outlaws multi-member districts. That's a federal law.
Well, yeah, there's that too. But no, because it would require it because the harder part is that you have all of the elections are run by the states. And so if one state said, okay, we're going to proportionally elect our representatives, then it would be at a disadvantage compared to the other states who didn't, right?
In what way?
Well, so let's say that, I'm California and I suppose, yeah, like, no, I don't know. It's because you're doing House districts. So each House district kind of works it has its own individual election. But like the question of like how would those elections work from, if they made it like multi-member.
I think in the past there were some districts in the House that were multi-member.
But what I mean to say is you need to do each reform state by state, right? You couldn't. I was thinking you had to do constitutional, but that was wrong.
Yeah. But I get the gist. I mean, it requires changing a federal law that would allow multi-member districts, and that is essentially as good as a constitutional change because you're not going to get a supermajority of Congress to approve that for sure. So, I think the constitutional piece is huge as well, and approval voting has a huge advantage there. I wanted to kind of take a little time before we wrap up to talk about this connection between for some reason, a lot of people who are in this voting reform, alternative voting methods space seem to also be, I know like Logan Bowers, who worked on the Seattle approval voting initiative, um, you, myself, have taken a really big interest in various aspects of economics.
Mm-hmm.
And could you maybe, given that you have this background in economics, could you sort of tie that together? Why is it? What is this connection between voting reform and economics? Because they don't seem to have anything. What does voting have to do with money, right? So,
Sure. I'll also bring up the computer programming part of it as well, because I think that there's a lot of like software engineers, and ultimately it's about systems theory and systems design, right? Like, so economics is not just the study of money; it's the study of systems, and one of the easiest systems to study is money because we have accounting, right? And so economics, the best explanation I ever heard for it in my philosophy economics class was the the study of preserving value, right? Like, so if we care about something, how do we make sure we don't waste it, right? And that can be our time, that can be our effort, the way that we love. Like, there are so many ways that like, it's how do we make decisions is economics, right? What decisions do we make and how? And how does that represent and affect our lives? And we create systems to make decisions. Specifically, voting reform best fits into a category of economics called social choice theory, where how do groups make decisions? And from very small groups to very large groups, and kind of like what are the game theory and strategies that play into that? Game theory, still relatively, like, game theory was invented in like the 60s, 70s, right, by the Rand Corporation, doing that study. So, and like John Nash and all that with Nash equilibrium. We need to take a step back and like, one of the questions that I think, this is a bit off topic, but like, why is approval voting just coming out now? Why are we thinking about this now, right? Why is this relevant? Why didn't people discover this ages ago? And people need to remember that game theory isn't that old, right? Like it's been around for a generation or two, and the decision to actually study voting methods with the tools of game theory didn't even emerge until like the 80s with the work done by who's the professor from NYU, Dr. Brahms, Stephen Brahms,
Steve Brams.
yeah, um, and a very very nice guy. So the reason I got into this, partially was the economics, but also like, as a software engineer, I'm trying to understand bugs, right? Every day, why does the system do what it does? It's not doing what I want it to do. How do we fix it, right? And with software engineering, you can go look at the code and print diagnostics and things like that. But you're always operating with a fundamental view of, if it's not doing the thing that I want, then the way that it's written is wrong, rather than it being an innate property of how it works. And also, like, software engineers are just told from a very throughout their entire career, if there's a problem, go fix it, right? Like, you are the engineer, you're the person who's meant to go in there and fix these things. And we think about numbers and theory and math and stuff. So I think that there's a really big Venn diagram where you get into if you work from first principles and you see, well, why doesn't the political system work the way that I think it should? Or the way that people are telling me that it should, the way that they tell kindergartners, it's a fair competition and the best person wins, right? Like, the best person didn't win, so what's wrong? You could just kind of go from there and figure that out. Did that answer that question?
Yeah, and I mean that's a good segue into the field. Similar to we have these reforms, these ideas to make voting better, to make democracy work better. What is the analog in the field of economics right now? If you could wave a magic wand and pass a reform or some reforms, like, what needs to be fixed about economics? Because I have a feeling similar to how most people walk around through their daily lives without a second thought as to, they might feel some sense that there's corruption, sure, and there are things that are imperfect about democracy, but I think a vanishingly small percentage of everyday people, probably in most countries, especially here in the U.S. certainly, we're not thinking, oh, this is all explainable because of this mechanistic design failure that we need to fix, right? It's a very obscure issue. And likewise, I think there's a lot that's broken in economics, and we don't really, in the same way we sort of feel subconsciously, there's this corruption layer beneath
Economics
everything.
or the economy?
I know that like Alaska, even a red state, just had a ballot initiative to raise the minimum wage, right? And that passed. Now, what are some things that are broken in the current system, and how should we fix them?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so. Stepping back, one of the biggest problem we have in the system we have is inefficiency. Inefficiency is corruption. It's waste. It's all the ways in which people do work and it doesn't go into the right place, right? People doing the wrong work at the wrong time or just being unemployed, right? And one of the things that drives me crazy is when people say, "Oh, well, there's really high unemployment." Not right now, obviously, but when there's high unemployment, and you think, well, is there not enough work to do? Because ultimately, like, if there's work to be done, we should be paying someone to do it, right? And that's how the economy should work. And if there's a problem with finances and interest rates and all these other abstractions, then there's that problem. Economics is also can be really, really bloody simple. We should subsidize the things we do want, and we should tax the things we don't want, right? Those are the two basic principles of economics, and they shouldn't be related, right? It doesn't matter. You shouldn't tax cars to pay for roads, right? That doesn't make any sense. If you want roads, pay for roads. If you don't like cars, tax cars, right? And or if like so one of the things your particular bugaboos is called hypothecation, where you think that there needs to be a relationship between what you tax and what you spend, which ends up being kind of a punch to your own head, where you think, well, I'm gonna offer free subsidized school lunches, but I'm still gonna tax people in order to go to school. You start with those two principles, you can get really far in making the world a lot better. And I wish that politicians would kind of like come at it from that perspective. Look, you and I agree that markets are a very efficient mechanism of finding prices, and often people manipulating prices, you need to take into account the effects on supply and demand, where if you put in price controls, you can lead to scarcity. If you put in subsidies, you can lead to overconsumption and waste. But I wish most policymakers would come from a economics perspective and said, okay, what's the greatest good for the least? What's the biggest bang for the buck, right? Like any business should come from. And if you're going to tax things, tax pollution. Don't tax income or labor, things like that. Like, tax pollution first, and for everything else, tax land, maybe. That's going to be a bit controversial and probably a subject for discussion somewhere else. But like most of the time, if you tax enough pollution, you're going to be good. And like ultimately let people make the decision about what they want to spend money on themselves most of the time.
Yeah, well, the with the roads, I would say that's actually a case where what we call hypothecation makes sense, because there's a direct link between the issue with hypothecation normally is, like, I'll give you an example, that the Berkeley City Council passed some law where they would have a sugary beverage tax. So you could justify that tax perhaps because you could say that a lot of the people consuming these sugary beverages are children, and it's affecting their health in negative ways, and it creates these externalities for society. But having gotten that revenue, they would then say that it's not just going to go into the general fund, and then we will decide how to spend the general fund on a case-by-case basis. But they literally had an earmark where a certain percentage of that money went directly to like some school, like school lunch program or something like that. And the reason that's a problem is then you end up making a policy choice about where to spend money. And it's not based on what is our total budget and what is the need for spending on this school lunch program relative to all the other things we could spend money on. Instead, that expenditure is dictated by some arbitrary factor, which is how much soda people decide to drink, right? Which doesn't make any sense.
The tax works, and then the number of soda that people drink goes down. Now suddenly the school lunches program is underfunded, and you've got hungry children who are going off campus to. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. Well, thanks for your time today, Felix. It was good talking to you.
Yeah, it was great talking to you too, Clay. This was fun. I'm looking forward to doing it again soon.
Do you have time to let people know where they can find you online? Is that a thing you want to
Yeah,
drop?
absolutely. Sure. So, I mean, I'm Felix Sargent. It's felix.sargent.com. And then, like, all of my contact information is on there. I'm trying to be less on the social media websites these days, just because I think I'm trying to protect my time. But God, an email will get you very far.
Sounds good. Until next time.
Okay. Talk to you later. Bye.